As shocking as what's happening in Palestine right now is, it's really nothing new. This week we've seen Palestinians get kicked out of their homes at gunpoint, tear gassed, shot and killed, arrested for absolutely no reason, and now Gaza is being bombed by the IDF relentlessly. But it's also important to remember that the Palestinians have been experiencing these things on a daily basis for the last 73 years. So to understand the true weight behind the spike in Israeli terrorism, we have to first understand the historical context, which is why we're speaking with Abby Martin, a journalist from the Empire Files who's reported extensively from occupied Palestine. Abby, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So in the past week or so, the issue of Palestine has basically become the talk of the world. And there was this whole issue in Sheikh, Jarrah, and then we saw the Israeli troops start firing into the al-aqsa mosque. And now, just a week later, Israel is collapsing. They're bombing buildings in Gaza. I mean, can you give us an overview of how we got here?
Absolutely. And when you're looking at corporate media, of course, it always starts with the rockets and then, of course, the unequivocal declaration that Israel has the right to self-defense. You absolutely never hear about what precedes such rockets. And you absolutely never hear about the context, the overall analysis of, the historical context that preceded all of this, right? And that continues to be ongoing. As you mentioned, Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, mobs of extremist settlers that are armed, mind you, have been expelling Palestinians out of their homes that they've had for generations in this neighborhood. We've all seen the videos. They are very harrowing and horrifying. People being thrown out of their homes by force, all of their material objects being thrown violently out of their homes. You have settlers who are obviously from America in the yards of Palestinians saying, if I don't take this home, someone else will, so I have to take it. This neighborhood has been under assault for quite some time. These settlers have just been waiting for what they deem as a mandate from the Israeli courts that they've been fighting for decades to try to seize and expel these Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Now, I think the important context to this also is that East Jerusalem, just like the West Bank, is under brutal Israeli martial law. Military law forbids Palestinians from protesting, convening in groups of 10 or more, raising a Palestinian flag. All of these things are illegal under martial law. And so it is very brave that Palestinians are protesting, let alone resisting in the ways that we're seeing now. So, of course, Sheikh Jarrah was violently mobbed by these settlers, thousands strong, chanting death to Arabs and burn their memories. Palestinians peacefully resisted these mobs of violent settler attacks. And of course, soldiers showed up to brutalize them and violently suppress the protests. And of course, all the Israeli soldiers stand on the side of the settlers. Now then, you have worshippers, hundreds of worshippers in al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the third holiest site in Islam, stationed in Jerusalem, praying during Ramadan. And then you had IDF soldiers storm the mosque, launch stun grenades and smoke bombs inside, tear gas as well, inside of the mosque, sent hundreds of worshippers to the hospital. This is a war crime, right? This is a war crime that what they did was actually tear gas and launch smoke bombs inside of the hospital after the worshippers were sent there. And then you saw harrowing footage of thousands of extremist settlers chanting, burn their memory again, erase their names outside of the burning al-Aqsa Mosque. This is a mosque that is ancient. It's 100 years older than the Notre Dame Cathedral. All of the historians were in mass uproar when the Notre Dame Cathedral was burning, and there is quite deafening silence over the intentional burning and attacks on this ancient compound. So all of this preceded the rocket attacks. Hamas, the governing force in Gaza, of course, issued a statement saying, we will retaliate if these attacks continue. And I think Israel made a miscalculation here. I think that they thought that they could violently expel these Palestinians and commit this ethnic cleansing with zero retaliation. And that was a miscalculation on their part because, of course, we saw the rockets fired in response. And Israel, like it always does, issues a wildly disproportionate response, demolishing entire homes with sleeping families inside, with sleeping families inside. And I just want to pose to viewers just this analogy, because I think it's really a stark analogy. Imagine a mob of armed Muslim extremists storming an ancient synagogue, chanting death to Jews. How do you think the media would respond to that? Or how about this? Imagine, let's say, a mob of Trump supporters that all were armed with weapons in an immigrant community in Texas, storming through the immigrant community, seizing people's homes and occupying them, violently throwing out the immigrants on the street. I can't imagine how liberal media would cover such a situation. So it really just shows you the extreme hypocrisy when it comes to media coverage of what's happening in occupied Palestine.
Yeah, and speaking of double standards, I mean, Palestinian activists have been told forever that Israel isn't a racist country, its existence and its history isn't based on the hatred of Arabs, and that it's actually a super progressive country, and that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, so-called, that they respect LGBT rights and so on. But this totally clashes with what we're actually seeing and what you're describing just now. And you're also seeing people, Israelis, who are saying, oh, well, this is just, the work of some extremists. They're dismissing it as extremism. But it really seems like this sentiment is mainstream in Israel. What do you think all of this that's happened in the last week, what do you think this really says about the political climate in Israel, and how widespread are these views?
I don't know many democracies that actually forbids 5 million residents, that it controls, every aspect of their lives, prevents any sort of democracy for those 5 million residents, 3 million in the West Bank, 2 million in Gaza. I wouldn't call Israel democracy, but it is interesting also that they've been able to run with the narrative that they are LGBTQ friendly and that they're this egalitarian place that welcomes, all religions to have a place there. I mean, look, with its foundation, Israel is a settler colonial state. It was founded, of course, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And right after the foundation of Israel came the Nakba, which was the horrific ethnic cleansing that expelled almost 1 million Palestinians from their homes, razed 500 Arab villages. Those who didn't leave their homes were killed. Several years after that, in 1954, was the Prevention of Infiltration law that basically said that any refugee trying to return there was a shoot to kill order. They also talked about laying mines in the routes of returns for refugees. So this is an order that's still in place. Of course, the enemy has somewhat shifted. Of course, they shield themselves from being able to commit these crimes with Hamas, now that Hamas is governing the Gaza Strip. But this has always been a rule that's been in place since the foundation of Israel. And Israel itself is a state that is founded on top of indigenous land. It's an ongoing settler colonial project that has been continuing for 73 years. And every single day we see the settler colonial project continue to expand, continuing to annex the entire West Bank, continuing to throw people out of their homes in a violent fashion, and continuing to kill and imprison anyone that resists. And I think this can all be summed up by something that's in place in East Jerusalem, which is called the demographic law, which essentially says that there needs to be a 70% majority Jewish population in East Jerusalem. So what does that mean? What does that mean if the percentage goes above 30%? Well, it means that you need to kick those people out, right, and commit ethnic cleansing to keep that artificial majority of the Jewish population. And essentially, that is what the foundation of Zionism is. It's an artificial majority that's imposed violently. And it means that in order to keep that majority, you need to expel or kill the indigenous population that is threatening that majority. This is a apartheid regime. This is a genocidal colonial occupation. And it's just quite fascinating that it's somehow been able to shroud itself in the notion that it's a progressive state and a democracy. It's quite the opposite. And you even see founders of the state of Israel. I mean, the first prime minister, Ben Gurion, when you look at what his statements were during the foundation of Israel, he says, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. This was an explicitly articulated sentiment across pretty much every leader of Israel, no matter how progressive the United States depicts them. I mean, look at Levi Eshkol during the 1967 war. He said, if we don't give them enough water, maybe their orchards will wither and yellow. And I think that that's a policy that they've obviously continued in place in Gaza, where people do not have clean, potable water and haven't for some time. It's a completely untenable situation. It's unlivable. And it's atrocious that people who call themselves progressive can actually bend over backwards and make the mental gymnastics to excuse this and somehow pretend that you can be progressive, except for the case of Palestine.
I was looking at this poll from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which surveyed Israeli youth, and it said that 66% of Orthodox youth, 42% of religious youth, and 24% of secular youth, quote unquote, hate Arabs, and 49% of religious youth and 23% of secular Israelis say they want to strip Palestinians of the right to vote. You guys at the Empire Files released a video called Everyday Israelis Express Support for Genocide, which the video kind of speaks for itself. I want to play a short clip for viewers. And by the way, these interviews were shot in a park called Tolerance Square in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. But here's the clip.
I think also that every Arab that doing a terrorism attack, we have to kill him, and not because he's an Arab, because he's a terrorist. I think you should also kick out the family, because it all begins with chinuch. How you say it?
Education. I don't think there's any answer to it.
Really?
There's only one way. Like, I would carpet bomb them.
You would carpet bomb them?
It's the only way you could deal with it.
I think that we're miserable. The Arabs make a פיגועים and we need to kill Arabs.
Okay.
We'll talk about this later.
And how God punished is the sins by other people. He said, he sent the Nazis, and now he sent Palestinians.
And I mean, these clips are almost prophetic in the way they sort of predict what's happening right now in Jerusalem. And what really amazes me is how nonchalant these people are. I mean, you hear people in the US talk about, being liberal Zionists and, Zionism isn't racism, whatever, but everything we see coming out of Israel is just this ultra right-wing nationalism, and it doesn't really seem like anyone stands against it, or if they do, they're quiet about it, or they're being coerced into being silent. Is there any real opposition to this racism in Israeli society? And if so, how are anti-racist and left-wing groups perceived in Israel?
Well, even Bet Salem, which is a human rights organization that simply documents what's going on, is considered an enemy, right? The word leftist is actually a slur in Israeli society. And I think people have to wrap their minds around what even the notion of liberal Zionism means, right? It's kind of this pink-washed notion of what Zionism is at its core, which is a racist settler colonial state that mandates that millions of people are kept under colonial occupation, brutal occupation. And then, of course, there's Gaza, 2 million people caged in this open-air prison. So the fact that liberal Zionists, they just kind of want to believe that they are progressive, but at the same time, they have to accept the reality of what Israel is. And they have to accept the reality of it's an exclusively Jewish state. What does that mean for the Arabs and the Palestinian population that live there? What's really the reality there is that there's this current of genocidal bloodlust throughout Israeli society. You can see this reflected in poll after poll. You can see it reflected in just the results of the elections, right? The vast majority of Israelis support the Likud government. They support Netanyahu. They support the ethnic cleansing. They support the ongoing massacres and atrocities carried out in Gaza. They support the ongoing occupation. And this is liberal Zionists as well. You see 80 to 95% support for things like the carpet bombing of Gaza in 2014, for things like the shoot to kill orders during the Great March of Return a couple of years ago in 2018. So these things are quite starkly reflected and quite obviously so. Of course, it's just not reported as such. When we were there in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be this very liberal safe haven for LGBTQ friendly people, there's gay bars, and it pretty much just feels like you're in like somewhere in America, right? A bustling city. Well, we just picked random people from all walks of life. We didn't cherry pick any of these interviews, and we got very honest answers of what people just simply think about the situation. We left it a very open-ended question and let people speak for themselves. What I found interesting about it was what would these people say when the camera isn't on? The fact that they were very, very just kind of leapt into this rhetoric that was nothing short of genocidal was very alarming. And they knew that they were on camera, right? They knew that they were speaking to a Western audience, and they were completely unabashed with these kind of sociopathic viewpoints about what should be done with Palestinians and Arabs. So the people who didn't say, obliterate them, kill them, bomb them into oblivion, said things like they should all be kicked out, right? Or we should give them a state so then we can actually have a war and drop one big bomb and that's it. One other person that I found, it was really disturbing, he said, we have the right to hate them. We should have the right to hate them. You had a young 17-year-old girl or so who looked like she was just, a cute little cheerleader, basically giggling and saying, death to all Arabs. So this is something that is extremely common. I think that in order to be an Israeli living within 48, you need to condone this behavior to a certain extent. You need to be okay. You need to be brainwashed to the point that you actually are okay with the ongoing colonization, right? The ongoing apartheid regime that denies 5 million people their basic human rights. And I think the Israelis that are truly left-wing leave. They flee. I mean, people who are anti-Zionist, they can't stay in a Zionist settler colonial state. So a lot of these people have passports for other places in Europe, and they just leave because they can't exist in such a fascistic, racist society that is just committing these atrocities against other people. And so that's why you have the liberal Zionists living comfortably there, and they just tell themselves that this is all necessary for their security and safety. And you even saw people who called themselves liberal Zionists and leftists tell us on camera they want a more humane occupation. That's the liberal Zionist viewpoint, is the occupation is important, but it should be more humane.
So I want to take a step back here a little bit and talk about how we got here, because this really isn't anything new. As you alluded to, Israel was created out of land theft. It couldn't exist without stealing Palestinian land. And in fact, the day Israel marks as its Independence Day is known by Arabs as al-Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe. It's coming up on the 15th of May. It was a long campaign of land theft and outright massacres of entire villages. I mean, they literally erased hundreds of Palestinian villages and replaced their Arab names with Hebrew names. But I think the really damning piece here is that the Zionist movement, which was the movement to create a Jewish state on top of the Palestinians, openly stated its intentions to ethnically cleanse Palestine. I mean, they openly collaborated with European colonizers like Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill. They spoke about Arabs as if they weren't even human beings. I mean, can you tell us about the racist history of the Zionist movement?
That's really at its core what Israel is. It was founded on this kind of racist colonization that still continues, and they've masked it in something else entirely. But at its core, from the very foundation of Israel, that's exactly what it has been. And as I mentioned, this has been articulated by pretty much every ruler of Israel since the foundation. The Nakba was an extremely horrific event. We're coming up on the 73rd year anniversary of the Nakba this weekend, and there's going to be solidarity actions all around the world. But the Nakba is particularly important because, the 500 villages that were razed, a lot of these people were expelled into refugee camps, not only in Palestine, but in neighboring countries. That's why a lot of the people actually fled to Gaza. And that's why 75% of people in Gaza are refugees from neighboring lands that they were ethnically cleansed from, right outside of this artificial border. And it's just a really horrific situation. I mean, the fact that generation upon generation, these refugees have just been left. And Israel has just been standing in flagrant violation of international law, because after the Nakba, after the catastrophe, the UN declared that Palestinians have the right to return. That's why Palestinians are seen holding the key. The key is a very symbolic image for them, because they believe that they have the right to return. Millions of Palestinians do have the right to return under international law to these homes. When we spoke to Ahmed Abu Artema, the lead organizer of the Great March of Return, he said the intent of the Great March was to kind of show the international community, mount this peaceful occupation in tents and encampments to show the international community that they are still refugees, to bring attention to their plight as refugees, and say, hey, 70 years later, we're still refugees without a home, and we still have nowhere to go, and we're still being treated like animals. And it was meant to just be a symbolic gesture. And of course, we all know what happened next, which is they were met with sniper fire. Hundreds were massacred in cold blood for simply peacefully resisting. And it really shows you that it doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter if they're peaceful or armed or anything. Israel will react in the exact same way. And they've even gone as far as criminalizing peaceful resistance and activism outside of Palestine, which is why you see all of these anti-BDS measures in 30 or so states here in the US. But yes, I think from its very core, Israel is a racist, colonizing entity, and it continues to be so. And especially during the Trump administration, Trump's allegiance and alliance with Netanyahu really kind of exposed and unmasked this as well, because liberals bend over backwards trying to excuse Israel for everything it does, claiming that, okay, it's the only democracy in the Middle East and we need to protect it and this and that. But I think their hatred for Trump caused quite a conundrum, because they couldn't explain away why Netanyahu loved Trump so much. And in fact, he was using Trump for his re-election campaign. There was giant banners unfurled of Trump shaking hands with Netanyahu. They named settlements after Trump. Of course, Jared Kushner's family was personally profiting off the settlement expansion and, had a bedroom for Netanyahu in his New York penthouse. So I think that reign of the Trump administration really did kind of shift the perception of Israel permanently in the eyes of a lot of liberals who realized that this whole notion of being progressive except for Palestine is completely impossible and untenable. And especially with the advent of social media, Israel cannot control the narrative anymore. This is how they basically manipulated the masses for so long, is weaponizing this notion of anti-Semitism and deflecting the fact that any criticism means that you're a racist and a bigot, which is absurd. But since the advent of social media, people are seeing for themselves for the first time the war crimes, the atrocities. You can't cover this up. You can't erase this away. And so every single time Israel goes on the offense and does things like this, more and more people wake up. Mass consciousness is permanently shifting in Palestine's favor.
So one thing that Palestinian activists have said repeatedly is that Israel's an apartheid state. And, I think some people confuse this as some kind of moralist slogan, but it's actually a tangible thing. It's a two-tiered legal system, one system of laws for Jews and another system of laws for Arabs, which actually makes all this racism that we're talking about a legal reality. The United States issued a whole report condemning this apartheid regime. You've seen this firsthand. What does Israeli apartheid look like, and what are the ramifications that this has on daily Palestinian life?
I think that the most stark depiction of apartheid is when you're in, of course, the occupied West Bank. As you mentioned, there's two tiers of legal systems for Palestinians and Jews. This is, obvious, dozens of laws across the occupied territories that prove this, right? And it's visceral. You can see it with your own eyes. There are different roads for Israeli settlers. For example, Palestinians only get like a month's supply of water at a time that they can put in a tank above their house, where Israelis and settlers can just set up an outpost to get immediate military protection, electrical wiring, and water lines run throughout their settlements that are illegal under international law. So it's just day-to-day things like this that are humiliating, dehumanizing for the Palestinian residents that live there. And of course, the checkpoints that you have to wait hours in line, and Israeli soldiers will just arbitrarily set up just barricades that just make day-to-day life impossible. They want it to be absolutely impossible, and they want these people to leave. I think the most harrowing depiction of apartheid is in a city called Hebron. It was one of the largest Palestinian cities that has been overtaken by Israeli settlers. There's a couple hundred Israeli settlers protected by thousands of Israeli soldiers. The city used to be a bustling hub of commerce, beautiful, historic, ancient sites, and now it's a complete ghost town because the settlers have moved in on top of Palestinian homes and shops and actually caged them in like animals. I'm not exaggerating. They are caged like animals with settlers living on top of their homes. You know, usually in the West Bank, in these villages, they'll move on top of the village in this kind of architecture of oppression. But this is just something totally beyond the pale because they're living on top of them, and they throw their sewage, they throw dirty diapers, they throw garbage, broken glass on top of the Palestinians who live below. Everyone there has a story. I mean, that's something that's really horrifying also once you're traveling there. You know, every Palestinian that you talk to has experienced death and loss and tragedy in just unspeakable ways. And we spoke to one shopkeeper who was living in Hebron, and he said that his wife was 8 months pregnant and she got shot by a settler, and she actually had the baby, and he said the baby's a miracle, and he's so grateful that he was able to keep the baby even though he lost his wife. His daughter was blinded in one eye because of poisonous sewage that was thrown on her by the settlers living above. And while we were speaking to this man, you know, his kids were playing, and there was barbed wire all behind him and just piles of garbage. It's really hard to explain how horrific it is and how this is just allowed. I mean, the effects on daily life, I mean, it's too numerous to even tell, but I will say that let's just think of ambulances. If you need treatment, you cannot get from one place to another because ambulances have to go through these checkpoints. When we were going into the occupied territories for the first time, one of the first things that we saw was actually an ambulance at one of these checkpoints, and they were pulling out the body to check for quote unquote weapons. And I don't know what happened to the person, but I know several people who say that they've lost loved ones because they weren't able to get medical attention in time because of the militarization throughout the West Bank. So it's just things like this that, I mean, apartheid is just so obvious and it's so glaring that you have to ask yourself, how has it taken so long to speak something so obvious? But needless to say, I am very happy that organizations are finally getting on board stating such a clear truth, because now that we can all agree that it's an apartheid state, now we can move forward with what to do about it. And that is mounting international pressure to make the apartheid regime fall.
So outside of the West Bank, Israel also wages this genocidal war against Gaza, which has been described in the past as an open-air prison where people have 4 hours of electricity a day, an unemployment rate that regularly exceeds 50%, and 97% of water is unfit to drink. They also recently just leveled a 14-story building in the last week. We saw them bomb this building to the ground, and they killed at least 28 people, including 9 children. You made a documentary called Gaza Fights for Freedom, which chronicles the March of Return protests at the Gaza border, and it's really just a moving piece, and I think it's a must-watch for anyone who's watching this right now. It's also been made free recently, so you have no excuse not to watch it. But what is Gaza, and just how bad are things there?
Absolutely. I mean, Gaza is essentially a warehouse for refugees. It is an open-air prison. It's been under a medieval siege by Israel for the last almost 15 years. You had the Israeli military chief right before they actually left Gaza say that they wanted Hamas to take control of the Gaza Strip so that everyone in Gaza could be deemed a hostile entity. And that was actually revealed in a WikiLeaks cable. So Israel wants Hamas to be used as a scapegoat so they could just collectively punish the 2 million residents who live in Gaza. This is an area that's completely partitioned off. It's one of the most densely populated areas in the world, 5 miles by 25 miles long. The people there have no mobility. This is the most fundamental, basic human right, is the freedom of movement. They cannot leave. You cannot go outside without permits authorized by Israel. So, for example, let's say you are diagnosed with breast cancer and you live within the Gaza Strip. Well, you'd be very lucky if you're able to get outside medical treatment. And that's why the survivability for breast cancer rates in Gaza is around 30%. Whereas opposed to if you live, let's say, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, your chances of survival are 86% for breast cancer. Once we saw the Great March of Return spark off, and of course that did spark off because the situation is completely unlivable. Even the UN said that it's an uninhabitable situation and it would be completely uninhabitable by 2020. Well, it's 2021. So where are we at? Where is the international community when it comes to what is going on in Gaza, where 2 million people are caged like animals, denied water, electricity, freedom to move, and medical attention? What do you think's going to happen? You think these people aren't going to retaliate when you torture people and push them to the brink? Of course they're going to. But of course, Israel will use any sort of retaliation and cloak itself in this self-righteousness of, oh, well, we need to defend ourselves from these rocket attacks that are just indiscriminately fired. Meanwhile, they have targeted munitions that target entire residential neighborhoods and families while they sleep in bed. And you mentioned the death toll is now up to 24 people, 9 children. You know, it's just unfathomable and unconscionable what Israel does to collectively punish anyone living in Gaza. And of course, the Great March of Return sparked off, and that's where you saw tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting their caged existence. Ahmed Abu Artema said that he saw birds flying between, Gaza and their ancestral lands, and just said this is against human nature. The occupation flies in the face of what it is to be human. I think that really just speaks volumes. And what we're seeing now is just another brutal bombardment of Gaza with no context, of course, being told to us by the corporate media. And this kind of collective punishment is just war crime upon war crime. To target a Hamas member's entire family while they're sleeping in bed is a war crime. And they also, ministers have come out and said that this is not going to stop. They are going to target many more buildings. You mentioned the Al-Sharooq Journalist Tower. This is a journalist tower that housed many international media outlets today that was leveled completely to the ground. And I think it really is important to understand that they know that there are journalists in these buildings. They don't care who is where. Everyone in Gaza is a Hamas target. Because if you live in Gaza, you are blamed for Hamas. It would be as absurd as if another country was bombing civilian targets here in the U.S., orphanages, hospitals, schools, and said, well, you guys elected Trump, right? So therefore, we can blame you for having elected Trump. And we can just indiscriminately bomb you and everyone that you know, and all of these civilian targets and infrastructure, and then use the completely dehumanizing talking point of human shields, which really, if you look back at history, the U.S. has used the term human shield to dehumanize any enemy that it's trying to wage war against. So this is a tale as old as time. What's stunning to me is that Israel can still get away with it and somehow claim that all of the children it intentionally kills are somehow human shields. It's just really, it's really disgusting.
Speaking of these totally demented IDF narratives about human shields and, children, one consistent theme through all of this is that the media is helping push out these distorted narratives. I saw a headline about the tower that was destroyed, the 14-story tower. The New York Post said that it was Hamas who killed those 28 people in Gaza. Like, they literally reversed the script and said that that it was Hamas that did what the IDF did. And they just made up this scenario where I guess people are supposed to believe that Hamas killed its own people. There was another incident where this settler drove his car into a group of Palestinians and he was trying to kill them, and the Palestinians responded by throwing stones at the car. And AP and Reuters cut out the first part of the video to make it look like the Palestinians just, got mad and they decided to throw rocks at a car. I think seeing this media distortion for a lot of people is just really shocking, but it's also nothing new to people who've been following this issue. As a journalist, can you just explain how badly the media distorts their coverage of Palestine?
Absolutely. It is really unbelievable, okay? And I think that it all started for me when I saw the Gaza flotilla massacre and the fact that the media was actually trying to portray innocent peace activists on a boat bringing aid to Gaza as violent perpetrators of aggression and justifying the fact that Israeli commandos were jumping on the ship that was in international waters and just executing people. And the fact that the media was actually all on board with the same narrative was pretty stunning and really eye-opening to me, and I just haven't looked back since. You mentioned the Al-Sharq Journalist Tower getting bombed and the media painting it as Hamas's fault. Well, I have to remind people that back in 2012, during Operation Pillar of Defense, Israeli authorities shelled that same journalist tower. They actually blew the leg off of an RT cameraman, my colleague at the time. And when my network asked for a response, a statement of why they did this, they said, of course we knew there were journalists in the building. Everything in Gaza is a Hamas target. And also, RT had taken a side in the coverage. RT had taken a side in the coverage. That is an explicit admission of war crimes and also a threat that if you simply cover the truth, you will be targeted and potentially killed for your journalism. So that was another eye-opening moment for me. Now, the media is just so unbelievably cartoonishly one-sided when it comes to Israel-Palestine that everything's told in the passive voice, right? Palestinians just somehow died. They were never murdered or killed. I remember during the 2014 massacre in Gaza, a missile bombed an entire cafe of people watching the World Cup, and the headline of the New York Times was "Missile Finds Cafe." Like the missile just actually had its own autonomy and found the people watching sports and then just decided to blow up. I mean, it is really beyond the pale and absolutely despicable that people can call themselves journalists and write these kind of headlines. I mean, editorialize in such a way that you are covering for these atrocities. You mentioned AP or Reuters. These are supposed to be like these impartial news wires that are then given to the papers that then editorialize the news. And really, it's unbelievable how one-sided they are as well. I mean, covering up for the fact that there was a settler attack that ran over 2 Palestinians, right? It's unreal. It really is unreal. And it's always, for example, when people are blown up in Gaza, it's always militants. It's state stenography that's just repeated by AP and Reuters and all of these other publications. And when, let's say, the soldier who just was killed at the border, well, that was just a civilian, according to the news. You see this time and again, and it doesn't matter what publication it is. It's always not only telling Palestinians that are being genocided in this passive voice where you never actually know, it's very obscure of how they're actually dying. But other than that, of course, there's absolutely no context to the situation. So it's always painted as, oh, it's just both sides of the struggle. Oh, it's just this religious conflict that's been happening for thousands of years. And I guess there's no solution to it. It's actually a very clear-cut solution. It's a very crystal clear reality. It's an oppressive colonial apartheid state that is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing against an indigenous population. And the fact that none of this context is allowed really speaks volumes, because the media is essentially an arm of the Pentagon. And you even see from the entire U.S. political establishment that the corporate media just falls in line and toes the line of whatever U.S. foreign policy is. And you have not seen a peep from Joe Biden or any of his cabinet. In fact, they're running cover for Israel. And that is why you see complete deafening silence from the U.S. political establishment, because they understand that Israel is a necessary military outpost for the U.S. empire in the Middle East. That's why it's fully protected and subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars to the tune of $10 million every single day. They need to protect it and shroud it with complete immunity. And that is why the BDS movement and international pressure is so crucial, especially to this government, especially as American citizens, because without pressure on our government, it's going to be very, very difficult for pressure to mount against Israel, because this government is really the main facilitator of what's going on.
You know, over the course of the last week, I think a lot of people have woken up to the fact that Israel is this racist apartheid state. And we've seen millions of people around the world protest, not just in the United States, but in Yemen, in Syria, in South Africa. But my question for you is, you know, beyond just raising awareness on social media and marching, what can people do to hold this criminal regime accountable?
Well, we need to first and foremost link the struggle of Palestinians to the struggle of anti-imperialism in general. And beyond that, the struggle of that a lot of liberals care about here. I mean, immigration policies. You see Israeli military technology caging immigrants at the border. The police, right? The entire Black Lives Matter movement, the militarization of police. All of our police forces, mostly all of them, are trained in Israel by Israeli police officers. You see an NYPD actually has an office in Tel Aviv. All of these things are connected, right? The increasing expansion of the military-industrial complex, the fact that every single cent is squandered to bolstering up these oppressive regimes around the world and subsidizing things like Israeli apartheid. Meanwhile, Americans are left with near nothing. I mean, we have no health care. We have no free college. People are really, really struggling during this pandemic. Those things need to be linked together. The consciousness need to be intermixed. People need to understand that all of these things can be rooted back to one source, which is this out-of-control U.S. empire that is oppressing so many people around the world. I think raising consciousness is actually the first and foremost, the most imperative thing that people can do, because Israel thrives on having the narrative in their favor. And so this is why it's so important to actually correct the record on the Palestinian behalf, because we need to show the world what's really going on, because once you see, you can't unsee the truth. And that is also, it's also imperative for American citizens to join solidarity actions in the streets, show numbers. This weekend, there's huge protests going on all over the country. We need to go out in numbers and show strength and resilience and stand with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. Beyond that, we need to join BDS movements. We need to join divestment campaigns. And we need to stand up against the increasing criminalization of this peaceful act of resistance. There's 30 states that have anti-BDS laws on the books. They are now passing laws that are criminalizing this at college levels, conflating Judaism with Zionism. And these are all just horrific things that I think just shows that Israel's running scared, the US government's running scared, and it really shows you that this kind of activism is working, because they know historically that this has worked, that it's the only thing that will bring down regimes like this. And this is why it's so crucial for us to get up, get out of our comfort zones, and link up with other activist movements, communities, Palestinian solidarity organizations, and really show up. Because it's only with numbers, and it's only building a huge anti-imperialist mass movement in this country that puts fear in the heart of our politicians, that we will actually see justice prevail.